So last week I mentioned how some of the truths that Jesus is telling us in this sermon series are pretty brutal. Today's reading is one of those brutal truths. Often referred to as Mark's little apocalypse, it would be easy to picture Jesus with a sign saying, "The end is near," as we hear some of the descriptions that he is saying of things to come. It's very easy to focus on the horrible apocalyptic things instead of the more important truth that Jesus is telling us here. In addition to it being a key line in the reading today, there's a reason why the title of today's message is "Do Not Be Alarmed." We're going to have to address some horrible realities today, but my hope is that we can all leave here seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, seeing the hope and promise tucked in with all the doom and gloom. Before we start diving into the reading, I want to address the difficulty that many of us today have with prophetic oracles. We have a tendency to think of them solely in the terms of predicting the future. We expect that experts should be able to take them and give us predictions about the future, despite the fact that the phenomenon in question are subject to wide variations. Experts, and sometimes much less than experts, are happy to offer their opinions. That is part of why there's so many doomsayers. Thousands of people have tried to predict when exactly the apocalypse will happen. Harold Camping had a high-profile prediction for May 21st of 2011. He supposedly calculated the date to be exactly 7,000 years after the biblical flood. When the date passed without incident, he declared his math to be off and pushed the date back to October 21st of 2011. Fortunately, his math must have still been wrong. Joanna Southcott reportedly heard voices predicting future events. She grew a following of 100,000 people, and in 1813, she announced that the following year she would give birth to the second Messiah, whose arrival would signal the end days. Sounds an awful lot like what Jesus was warning about. No child was born, and she passed away. I could continue giving examples all day long, but we need to understand that in the Old Testament, prophecy provides a different framework for the statements about the future. They were diagnosis of the moral or spiritual health of the people. The real intent of the prophetic word of judgment was to promote repentance and reform. The prophesied destruction would only occur if the warning went unheeded. We see this in the story of Jonah. Jonah delivers God's message. 40 days more, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. Then Nineveh repents and is spared from the wrath that was promised. Really, prophetic speech was a form of instruction, not fortune-telling. We start off the reading with one of the disciples, it's not specified which one, being so impressed and awed by the size of the stones and the buildings that he can't help but mention it. Throughout Mark, we have seen several of the disciples mentioned by name as they missed the point of Jesus' teachings. Maybe Mark figured they had been called out enough and left who it was out this time. Whoever it was, they did miss the point that Jesus had just made in last week's reading about showing off wealth and power. Jesus and the disciples are on their way out of the temple, so this is almost immediately after the scene with the widow and her 2 small coins. Now, I do want to give you an idea on why this disciple was so impressed. Some of the temple's foundation stones were up to 37 feet long, 12 feet high, and 18 feet wide, and would have weighed over 500 tons. That would be very impressive to see, and rather awe-inspiring. Jesus is not impressed, though. Despite the massive size of the stones, he says, "Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." There are a few important details about how Jesus words his prediction. First, this prediction differs from the false charges that were brought against Jesus during his trial. In the false charges, they claim that Jesus said he was going to destroy the temple. They say, "We heard him say, I will destroy the temple that was made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another, not made with hands. Or, aha, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. In his prediction here, Jesus doesn't make any claim to be the agent of its destruction. Second, his announcement of doom shows that the so-called cleansing in Mark 11:15, where he overturns tables and drives out the money changers, can also be read as judgment. Despite Jesus' acts at the time, the temple wasn't purified or restored to the function for which God had intended it, and so it was later destroyed. Lastly, the Old Testament prophets had made very similar predictions about the first temple. Micah 3:12 says, "Jerusalem will become a heap of rubble, and the temple will be a mound overgrown with thickets." This did happen to the first temple, and the Jews would have been very familiar with that prophecy and other ones of the older prophets, and it would have likely been pretty disturbing. The reading then jumps to Jesus and the disciples on the Mount of Olives, and them asking Jesus privately when this will be. Jesus doesn't either give them a specific time or a clear sign like they were asking for. He also never really goes back to the destruction of the temple. While the destruction of the temple may have prompted the question and been related to Jesus' answer, the apocalyptic prophecies concerning the end times and the rest of Mark 13 do seem to be separate. The temple was destroyed just as Jesus had predicted in 70 CE during the siege of Jerusalem in the First Jewish-Roman War. Following a 5-month siege, the Romans destroyed the city, including the Second Temple. Mark's Gospel was written right about the same time, so it's likely that the destruction of the temple occurred just after or during its writing. Mark may have intentionally created more separation between the apocalyptic prophecies and Jesus' comments on the destruction of the temple in an attempt to diffuse the speculation that the judgment was near. For us, looking back on it, the destruction of the temple as Jesus predicted, the certainty with which he foresaw events that are now past, should encourage us as readers to have confidence in his words about the future. However, also looking back on it, it's easy to forget that his prophetic words of judgment must have seemed unbelievable at the time. You saw the picture of the massive stones, the size of them. We have visual evidence of the massive architecture that inspired the original expression of awe. Who could believe that something that massive could be overthrown and torn down? This is a good reminder to us today that no matter how secure buildings or institutions may appear, they can all be overthrown. The disciples are just looking for a sign or a time for when this will happen. Much like how if someone told you that your house was going to be destroyed, you'd want to have some idea on when. I imagine the disciples were probably a little frustrated with Jesus' answer, especially his initial reply, since it didn't provide the disciples with the sign that they were seeking. Instead of giving them a clear-cut answer, Jesus tells them how to conduct themselves in the midst of turmoil and persecution. They must not be led astray, and they must be willing to testify the gospel, even though they will be persecuted, as he describes just a few lines after today's reading. Like many of his private instructions to disciples, it's all about discipleship. The line, "Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' can be a little unclear. In the original Greek, instead of "I am he," it just says, "I am." Since who it's referring to is not supplied, we have to decide who it is they claim to be. It could be that since they are said to come in Jesus' name, they may be depicting themselves as the Lord's agents or inspired prophets. Since the expression "in my name" implies acting on an authority derived from Jesus, it could be not claiming to be Jesus himself returned to the earth, just someone with his authority. The name in question may be Messiah or anointed, rather than Jesus, So it could be someone claiming to be the Messiah. It could be flat out claiming to be Jesus himself. When God sent Moses back to Egypt, he said his name is I am who I am, and to tell the Israelites that I am sent you. With the Greek word just being I am, it could be claiming to be God. Regardless of who they claim to be, the warning about not being led astray still applies. In troubled and turbulent times, it's very tempting to cling to anything that offers a sense of safety, even if it is a false sense of security. Jesus counsels both hope and patience. He warns that the Christians shouldn't engage in rash apocalyptic fervor that they see around them. We shouldn't just latch onto anything, hoping that it might help us. Some of you may remember Bert the Turtle. Bert was the mascot for the duck and cover drills. These were started in the early 1950s in response to the Soviet Union detonating its first nuclear device in 1949. The sudden threat of atomic attack signaled a new and terrifying phase in the Cold War. There was a growing concern and panic. President Harry S. Truman's Federal Civil Defense Administration program started the drills in an aim to educate the public about what an ordinary person could do to protect themselves. In 1951, the FCDA made a film, Duck and Cover. Bert the Turtle, the film's animated hero, was shown dropping to the ground, which was the duck, and then retreating into a shell, which was the cover, after an explosion. In the film, an atomic attack was presented as just one more danger that children could learn to protect themselves against, similar to a fire, automobile accidents, or even a bad sunburn. It instructs students to make like Bert, directing them to duck under the tables or desks or next to walls and tightly cover their backs and their necks and faces. These drills continued for some time and didn't really fade out until the 80s. There is an argument that in the early 1950s, duck and cover may have helped, since the majority of the weapons that the Soviet Union would have had would not have been nuclear, and even the nuclear weapons that were around at that time had limited capabilities. If an atomic bomb went off some distance away, duck and cover may have provided some protection. If one went off right over your head, there was no doubt that a school desk would not have protected you. Even by the early 60s, with the advancement of weapons, duck and cover had came to look wholly inadequate as a response to nuclear threat. But people latched onto it, though. They were scared, afraid that the world as they knew it was ending. They were desperate for anything that would make them feel safe. Looking back on them now, it seems almost ludicrous, but at the time, it was a life preserver for people who felt like they were drowning. The social and political turmoil of the age is not to be mistaken for the end time. Jesus and Mark don't deny that there's a crisis that exists. Every age has had times that felt like everything was going wrong, and it was the start of the end times. Jesus clarifies that those things are not the end, but the beginning of birth pangs. Now, this reference to birth pangs is a really good analogy. They can come on suddenly. You never know exactly when they will start or how long they will last. Later in the chapter, Jesus says, "But about the day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Beware, keep alert, for you do not know when the time will come." He finally gives the disciples their answer, but it's not the straightforward answer that they were hoping for. I think, and this is what I think based off of how prophetic speech usually functions in the Bible, that the predicted end times are a moving target. I don't think that there's any way for us to figure out exact time that it will occur. It'll happen when it's needed and when it's right for it to happen, and only God can determine when that is. That's purely my opinion, but especially since Jesus says no one but God knows when, it seems like it would be wasted effort to try to calculate or figure out exactly when. So we should do as Jesus recommends. and keep alert. Do our best to be ready for when it does happen. There is a reason why it's recommended that as someone starts getting close to their expected due date, that they have a go bag ready. The last thing you want to be doing when the baby decides to come is to be scrambling, trying to get things together because you weren't ready. Similarly, you don't know how long you might be at the hospital or when you will get to go home. You don't want to not have what you'll need when you're able to finally leave. There really is no telling just how long birth pangs might last. The stages of labor usually last between 6 to 18 hours. 3 weeks before her due date, Nicole Jameson went to the restroom thinking she needed to relieve herself. It turned out that her water broke, and in only 9 minutes, she had given birth to her son. At only 21 weeks pregnant, Joanna Kristonik went into labor. Due to the risk to her children, doctors did what they could to try to stop contractions. She lay on a bed 24 hours a day at a 30-degree angle with her feet pointed upwards for 2.5 months, 75 days before she gave birth to her 2 children. I'm certain that neither one of these ladies expected things to go like they did or in the time frame that they did. The other reason that I think birth pangs is such a great analogy is because when they happen, they are incredibly painful and difficult, but there is an amazing reward waiting for us afterwards. A new life. Now, for first-time parents, that might be more terrifying than anything in today's reading. But once they get past that, they can truly appreciate the miracle that those birth pangs led up to. Jesus describes a lot of terrible things that are going to happen, but after everything, after all the pain and suffering, wars and disaster, chaos and destruction, will come new life in God's perfect kingdom. Jesus doesn't tell us all this just to scare us. He tells us this both to warn us and to assure us that God is still with us and will be through everything. Like the perfect Lamaze partner, that's why he says, do not be alarmed. Mark's little apocalypse isn't meant to tell us exactly when this is going to happen, like the disciples had wanted. Jesus says that no one but God knows. Really, this is more like a rumble strip. It's meant to jar us, which it does very well, and make sure that you stay awake and don't go too far off course. When it feels like the world is ending, do not be alarmed. Do as Jesus advises and hold firm to your faith and your belief. Don't let yourself be led astray by false hopes or false promises. Know that Jesus and God are always right there with you, holding on to your hand, gently encouraging you to breathe. Amen.